Thank you, Professor Hayden. Last but not least, we have Mitch Taylor. Dr. Taylor, thank you once again for agreeing on such short notice to fill in for Keith. Dr. Taylor is formerly a polar bear biologist with the Nunavut government in the Northwest Territories in Canada. He is now affiliated with Lakehead University in Canada. And today this morning he will talk about polar bears as a case study for how CO2 politics drive policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mitch Taylor.
Thank you very much. As I say, it was short notice here, but I'll do my best. I'd like to talk today about how a whole field of study, most of my colleagues were captured, and I feel co-opted by the whole CO2-driven climate change environmental movement. First, I'd like to give an abbreviated history of how polar bears have come to be viewed as the sort of the archetypical example, I guess, of an impacted species by carbon dioxide-driven climate change. In 2005, there's a polar bear specialist group that meets periodically. Was the first IUCN-SSC specialist group to consider polar bear status, polar bear research. It's associated with the International Agreement for Conservation of Polar Bears. And we met in 2005, and something came up at that meeting that kind of caught many of us by surprise. A number of the members were concerned about climate change, and they had reason to be. There was sea ice deterioration in several of the populations where they were working. Some of the researchers had long-term studies happening there. This was sort of, we knew about this, we knew about these decadal oscillations, but we hadn't seen such a decline since studies had started in the late 1960s. There was a concern about what was causing this. Was it progressive? Was it cyclic? So we agreed, without knowing really too much about climate, there were no climate change specialists there, no climatologists. We agreed that polar bears should probably be uplisted to vulnerable, just because of this new threat we didn't really understand. And vulnerable under the Red Book classification just means a decline of perhaps 30% over the next 3 generations, which would be about 35 or 40 years for polar bears. Well, very next year, under the prodding of the Center for Biological Diversity, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service brought a proposed rule forward to uplist polar bears under the Endangered Species Act to threatened. And again, this was sort of a shock to most of us. We kind of had a sense that there might be something in the works, but didn't really understand that it was going to go through formal process so fast. The people who wrote this article accepted the ICCC sort of statements that CO2-driven climate change was a reality as best information. And that's even actually in this international agreement. We have to go by the best scientific information. They didn't look at any other alternatives. They knew that there were people who disagreed, but they just ignored that. And they admitted that. So they came forward with the rule in 2006. And through 2007, there was some debate about this. There were some new papers released, a whole series of papers, in fact, by the U.S. Geological Survey and Canadian Wildlife Service that were showing impacts. But it's important to realize that all of the concern for polar bears was not concern based on the current status of polar bears. There's about 24,000 right now. And in total, the total loss so far due to climate change impacts, whether they're anthropogenic or natural, is only about 165 individuals. That's what's been documented. So a decline from 24,000 to whatever 24,000 minus 165 is hardly cause to call them threatened with extinction, but that's exactly what happened. In 2008, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife listed polar bears as a species at risk, threatened status, but also made a rule that that status couldn't be used to regulate carbon emissions or cut back on gas and oil exploration and development. And that rule has now come into concern. I'll mention that a bit later. In Canada, our Committee on Endangered Species and Wildlife in Canada, COSEWIC, did not uplist polar bears. They simply didn't, They're concerned about greenhouse effects. I mean, nobody at that point was really sort of looking at alternatives, at least in the circles that I travel in. But the fact that the polar bears hadn't been reduced in numbers, that most, as far as we could tell, were still abundant and productive, seemed to sway that group, and they did not uplist. But they're still a species at risk in Canada as well. So in 2009, now there's essentially a rule exempting the global warming considerations, in a sense doing away with the interior rule that would not allow this habitat threat to be regulated. There's a rule kind of removing that rule attached to the Omnibus Appropriations Act. If it stays on there, and maybe it's already passed, I haven't really been following it. If it stays on there, what it will mean is that environmental protection and essentially any development will have to go through that involves energy, oil and gas, CO2 emissions, will have to go through an environmental impact statement. And if they can't show that what they're doing isn't going to impact world climate and sea ice eventually through greenhouse warming, then they may not be allowed to go forward. So, and there's I guess if you've been following the news too, there's a whole institute that's been identified in California sort of just for this kind of litigation. So you're going to hear more about polar bears, I'm guessing. I'm guessing this thing probably will remain with the Appropriations Act, and I'm guessing people will start to use it to start already before there's any cap and trade sort of, legislation to start to regulate emissions and exploration and development. In the future, what's coming up? 2009, the same polar bear specialist group is meeting in Copenhagen, I believe it is, to consider the status of polar bears and evaluate Canada's COSEWIC report, an unprecedented sort of move, but the chairman of the specialist group has asked the specialist group to review this. By the way, they're all 100% behind this CO2-driven climate change thing. I have been in the specialist group since 1981, but I am no longer a member of the specialist group. I was removed from that group. So there's a technical consensus that's probably going to come out of there that, yes, carbon dioxide is causing the Arctic to warm, that's eroding sea ice, that's causing polar bears to decline, and something should be done about that. They may even decide to uplist polar bears another notch on the Red Book scale. And again, this is all at a time when population viability analysis studies are suggesting polar bears are abundant and productive. Some of these are dated. Some of the populations clearly have been affected by the Arctic warming period. You probably heard more about that in some of the talks. But the other information that's actually not being considered very much is Inuit information. It's we call it traditional ecological knowledge, TEK. But the people who actually live and hunt polar bears, or live in the same area and hunt polar bears, they've called this time the time with the most bears. And the harvest regulations that have been put in place have caused populations that were previously depleted to increase. And probably now is the time when we've probably had the best management, the most polar bears in the last 100 years anyway. It's ironic that they're being identified as a species at risk. So anyway, just to quickly go through how this all came about. There's the greenhouse effect. I won't even bother speaking to this slide. I've cut a lot of the climatology out of the talk just because other people have done it better during the meeting, and I'm sure you can get the story straight from them, have already. But the story is, as we've just seen in the last two talks, essentially an alignment of carbon dioxide and temperature increases. They have generated graphs using their models to show that the observations of the models very closely match the actual temperature record. But if you leave out the anthropogenic forcings, the carbon dioxide that's produced, the increases, then essentially the models don't track very well the observed temperature increases. And so for that reason, and I think they even state that 96% or something like that of the variation is explained by carbon dioxide. But again, what I take from this graph, especially the bottom one down here, is that they're not really climate models, they're more carbon dioxide projection models. Because if carbon dioxide doesn't vary, then temperature doesn't vary. So without varying one of the components, I mean, it's not really a surprise that carbon dioxide drives temperature in their models. They're created that way. That's all they could do. It's a tautology, really, in terms of logic. So what's happening? Well, one of the projections of the model, and I'm sorry I don't have a slide, is that some of the first impacts and some of the greatest impacts will be at the poles. So one of the things that we follow very closely in the polar bear world is what's happening with the sea ice. And what I've shown here is sort of a suite of models picked based on the ones that seem to fit the increase in the 80s and 90s the best, and what they're suggesting about what's going to happen with sea ice in the Arctic. And as you can see, there's a mean and there's some variance around that. The red line is what's actually observed, and as you can see, the actual decline in Arctic ice has was quite a bit greater than what was predicted. And of course, the response from the climate modelers has been, oh my God, it's much worse than we thought. And my response when I look at that is, well, the models are not predicting what's actually happening. There's a flaw in the models. And it's even worse than that. I'll get to that in a bit later. What's happened is we actually have seen Arctic warming in the last 10 or 12 years, and that has had an impact on sea ice, quite a big impact. You can see sea ice has been reduced over time, and that reduction in sea ice has caused polar bears in some areas to be impacted demographically. And the way that works is as the ice declines, the bears summer over deeper water. If they're in the Arctic basin areas, the bears may have poor nutrition and be reduced in terms of recruitment, size. This can have demographic impacts and has been shown to have demographic impacts on a couple of populations. And so Center for Biological Diversity, World Wildlife Fund, the environmental organizations, I mean, they latched right onto this, right? Because this is just what they were hoping for. Here's a charismatic megafauna. People care about polar bears, supposed to be the world's second most popular species. They may not be able to save panda, but they could save the polar bear. So huge efforts have gone in. In fact, World Wildlife Fund has supported some of the research that's actually shown the decline of polar bears in some of the areas. So a lot of effort went into making it seem as bad as possible. Skinny bears, dying bears were seen, and that's because the sea ice is disappearing because of carbon dioxide. The bears are being forced to eat each other. There's cannibalism happening, and there's the examples, and this is true. Here's another example of cannibalism. The big guy in the background here is the actual eater. This is a subadult male. Bears are being forced to go to alternative food sources, which are putting them in conflict with humans. This is actually the Churchill dump from many years ago. But there are all these various human-bear interactions. It's become a safety hazard. The Inuit are wrong. They're simple people. They just don't understand the bears. There's not more bears, as they're saying. It's just the bears are being forced to come to the communities now for food, and that's why they're seeing more. It's like people who live on the land, people who can navigate in all kinds of Arctic conditions without GPS, and who have an oral tradition going back for millennia on these kinds of things, land skills, that they'd be fooled so easily that they would just be mistaken and think that the bears in town were indexing something that they were not. Bears are on thin ice. I think I showed some of these things last year. Well, what's really happening, we have 19 populations, and for most of them, we have either dated information or no information. But for these two populations, we have some fairly recent information. And there have been, as I said, demographic impacts in the southern Beaufort Sea and in western Hudson Bay. In western Hudson Bay, as I mentioned, there's a long-term decline has been identified, and there's some technical problems with the analysis, but I think the numbers are good enough to at least say that there has been a decline. They're estimating about 165 bears over a 20-year period. And again, that's the total decline in polar bear numbers for a species that's 24,000 strong. In the Beaufort Sea, the data weren't as good. They weren't able to demonstrate a significant difference between population numbers historically and population numbers now, but the demographic rates suggest that these bears would be declining with no harvest with a probability of greater than 70%. And I believe it. I think it is true. Two other studies, adjacent populations, indicated nutritional effects, but no demographic effects so far. Two other studies indicated large numbers, but no indication of demographic effects or numerical effects yet. Polar bears are actually pretty well adapted to deal with even a fairly long-term downturn in their conditions. They have low reproduction rates but high survival. Basically, if they can stick around and survive until conditions improve, the population typically isn't impacted. So basically, if you look at this based on population size, for the Davis Strait and the Barents Sea, which the larger fraction, bears look like they actually increased over the past 20 years there. The North Beaufort, Southern Hudson Bay populations stayed constant, but two of them probably did decline. So what have we got happening here? We've got basically a problem with the climate change guys right now, because the climate isn't warming. The climate has actually been cooling since about 2003. But carbon dioxide has been increasing, at least according to the records that were provided. So if carbon dioxide is increasing, but the world climate isn't warming, what's to be done? And again, that's just showing the decline since 2003. And so that's why the Arctic is quite important, because the Arctic temperatures have warmed, but it's been entirely natural. And that's not just my analysis or something that's new information that's not available. This is something that's in the literature. I'll show you the citations in a bit. What's actually happened is there's been a number of things that occurred that are regarded as anomalous, meaning not systematic, not progressive, but just odd things that happen that sometimes do happen in world climate. A lot of the surface water comes in from the North Pacific through the Bering Strait, and there was a big influx of warm North Pacific water. And that warm North Pacific water caused early breakup and elimination of the sea ice. Sorry, I'm showing myself here, but you can't see it. That's the Bering Strait. The warm North Pacific water basically caused a lot of melting in the Western Arctic. It was coupled, thank you.
Push that button.
Thanks very much, yeah. The warm North Pacific water caused a lot of melting in the Western Arctic. At the same time, strong offshore winds, which are atypical as well, pushed a lot of the ice over in the transpolar current, and a lot of, again, 85% of the sea ice that's eliminated from the polar basin is eliminated down this East Greenland current. And so there was a lot of elimination of the multi-year ice. The big open water area that was caused by this melting and this wind pushing created a greenhouse effect, all right, but it was due to water vapor, not carbon dioxide. So there was additional warming from that. And of course, the warmer water, because it exits down through the Canadian Arctic archipelago, right down in through Hudson Bay, was also affecting the Churchill population. So what these guys were seeing in their polar bear studies was real. Ice habitat was reduced. It was caused by a change in climate, and that effect was general. Almost something like more than 2/3 of the world's polar bears are in this area, most of them within the archipelago. So they were seeing something real, but they were attributing the problem to the wrong cause, carbon dioxide-induced climate change, when actually it was just natural climate change. And this is showing basically the Arctic warming that's occurred since since about the late 1990s. Willie had this up this morning, again showing that a lot of the warming appears to be correlated with the sun, but there has definitely been warming, and that warming has occurred. Part of the reason that we got the strong offshore winds is that we've had negative Arctic oscillation over the last 10 years. So the usual westerly winds that cause the winds to be sort of more north and westerly there, even in the summer, were reduced. I'm not going to get too much into the climatology. It's not my area, but enough to say that there's a concurrence that the majority of some of the authors would put climate change issues in there, but the majority of the cause was due to natural causes. This is what the sea ice looked like when it was pushed out from the shore. And you can see here, this is the exit. This is toward the end of the summer of 2007. So anyway, the Arctic warming period is real. This is just a list of the various things that I've gone through. Warm water from the North Pacific, offshore winds, enhanced warming from cloud formation, loss of the multi-year ice, which by the way is a positive feedback mechanism, because that multi-year ice is a lot thicker, there's a lot more ice mass, it melts slower. So now it's pretty much all annual ice, which means it's vulnerable to earlier breaking up and later freeze up, and that could cause a delay, a lag time in the recovery as we go to more colder conditions. And as Willie mentioned as well, there are solar effects. A couple of the authors also identified a global warming signal, but I think they didn't really go into the mechanism, and I think that was just because carbon dioxide has increased. This is from my talk last year, and I'll just go through it very quickly. Basically, it's to the effect that even if the carbon models or carbon dioxide models were correct, they're only projecting a decline in sea ice, and that's, again, on the graph, that only goes to 60%. A decline in sea ice of down to around 30% of the original amount. And if that was projected directly onto polar bear numbers, we'd be reducing from 24,000 down to about 18,000. Well, that's hardly cause to call them threatened with extinction. There might be reductions, there might be changes in range, we might even lose a couple of populations. But anyway, in summary, polar bears appear to be abundant and productive in most populations. They're not threatened with extinction or CO2 levels, and CO2 levels were not the cause of the recent Arctic warming period or the habitat loss experienced during that period. So the assertion of progressive loss of sea habitat from the anthropogenic global warming is not supported. And so I believe that we should follow the international agreement, and polar bear management should be supported on sound conservation practices, but based on the best scientific information, which is not climate model projections. Thank you.